Chapter 25, Chains of Justice, Part 1. The ground was still trembling when the first wave of dwarven militia marched into the wreckage. Smoke billowed from shattered stonework, rising into the faint light filtering through the massive gates of Brumkoroth. The disciple was gone, its monstrous form reduced to lifeless rubble, but the destruction it had wrought remained like an open wound on the city. Lucas stood amidst the carnage, his breath ragged. His hands trembled, a mix of exhaustion and residual fear from the battle. Mina was slumped against a broken column, one hand pressed against her temple where dried blood streaked her face. Her once bright blonde hair was matted with ash and sweat. Thomas, ever the steady presence, crouched beside her, his shield dented and his expression grim. The clang of heavy boots on stone pulled their attention. A phalanx of dwarven soldiers advanced, their steel armor reflecting the pale light of the cavernous city. At their head was a stout captain with a braided beard that swayed as he moved. His face was set in a stony glare, and his gauntleted hand rested on the hilt of an ornate axe. "Drop your weapons," the captain commanded, his voice booming. Lucas hesitated, his instincts screaming to run or fight, but Thomas raised a hand. "We're not your enemies," Thomas said, his deep voice calm yet firm. "We helped stop the disciple." The captain's sharp eyes flicked to the lifeless remains of the disciple, then back to the party. "And yet here you stand among the wreckage of our city, surrounded by the bodies of dwarves who won't see another dawn." Mina, struggling to her feet with Thomas's help, met the captain's gaze. "We didn't cause this," she said, her voice weaker than she intended. "We fought to save your people." The captain's expression hardened. "And who unleashed such a beast in the first place? Was it not the cult you've been aiding?" His hand tightened on his axe. "Save your words for the judges." Before Lucas could respond, a shout from the rubble drew their attention. A group of medics rushed toward Wallace, who had collapsed just moments after the battle's end. Blood seeped through his coat, staining the stone beneath him. His once pristine demeanor was gone, replaced by the frailty of a man who had given everything in the fight. "Take him to the infirmary," the captain barked to his men. "But mark my words, he doesn't leave this city until we've sorted out the truth." The soldiers moved quickly, lifting Wallace onto a stretcher. Mina started forward, but Lucas caught her arm. "He'll be okay," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. "Bind their hands," the captain ordered, gesturing to the party. "Escort them to the Hall of Justice." The dwarves moved with practiced efficiency, confiscating their weapons and securing their wrists with thick iron shackles. Lucas felt a flash of anger as the cold metal bit into his skin, but he forced himself to stay calm. This wasn't the time to resist. As they were led away, Lucas cast a glance back at the battlefield. Among the wreckage stood Tolgar, the interim leader of the Cult of the Sent Ones. His dark robes were smeared with dirt and blood, but his eyes held a resolute gleam. He watched the party in silence, his expression unreadable. Lucas couldn't tell if Tolgar was relieved they were still alive, or if he was merely sizing up the next pieces in his strategy. The city streets were eerily quiet as the party was marched through the heart of Brumkoroth. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and blood. Civilians peeked out from windows and doorways, their faces pale with fear and suspicion. The damage from the disciples' rampage was evident everywhere. Collapsed buildings, shattered bridges, and craters in the once pristine stone roads. Lucas caught snippets of whispered conversations. "Those are the ones who fought the beast. But aren't they with the cult? Why didn't they stop it sooner?" The weight of their stares pressed on him, and he lowered his gaze. He felt Mina lean slightly against him as they walked, her steps faltering. "Are you okay?" he whispered. "Just tired," she murmured. "And everything hurts." Thomas, walking on Mina's other side, gave her a steadying hand. "We'll get through this," he said quietly. "We always do." Ahead of them, the looming Justice Hall came into view. Its stone facade was adorned with intricate carvings of dwarven lawgivers, their stern faces seeming to judge all who entered. Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that those stone eyes were fixed squarely on him. As they approached the entrance, the captain turned to the party. "You'll get your chance to speak," he said, his tone grudgingly neutral. "But know this, we don't take lightly to outsiders meddling in our affairs. Whether you save the city or not, You'll answer for what's happened here." Lucas met the captain's gaze, his exhaustion giving way to determination. "We'll tell the truth," he said. "And we'll prove we're not your enemies." The captain's eyes narrowed and he gave a curt nod. "We'll see." With that, the heavy doors of the justice hall creaked open, and the party was ushered inside, their fates uncertain and the weight of the city's judgment looming over them. The justice hall of Brumkoroth loomed around them like the inside of a vast stone colossus. The chamber echoed with the sound of heavy boots on the polished floor as Lucas, Mina, and Thomas were marched deeper into its labyrinthine halls. Chains rattled with every step, and the dwarven militia flanked them like an unyielding wall of steel. Lucas's thoughts raced as they passed row upon row of carved stone pillars, each etched with scenes of dwarven lawgivers meting out justice. The air was cold, thick with tension, and the faint tang of iron and dust hung in his nostrils. The events of the past day played over and over in his mind. The chaos, the destruction, the disciples' final devastating assault. For a moment, he wondered if they could have done more. They were led into a smaller, dimly lit chamber. A broad table of dark stone dominated the space, surrounded by high-backed chairs that dwarfed even the dwarves themselves. The captain motioned for them to sit. "You'll remain here until your hearing," he said curtly. "Speak only when spoken to. Any trouble, and you'll regret it." The militia filed out, leaving a pair of guards stationed by the door. The heavy sound of the lock sliding into place echoed ominously. Mina leaned back in her chair, her face pale and drawn. "I don't like this," she muttered, wincing as she shifted her weight. Her injuries were worse than she let on, and Lucas could see her struggling to stay upright. "None of us do," Lucas replied, "but fighting them isn't an option. Not here." Thomas glanced toward the door, his broad shoulders tense. "It's not just about us anymore. Wallace is in the infirmary, Goldar's already been arrested, and the Sent Ones are leaderless without Grimbar. Tolgar's barely holding the cult together." He crossed his arms. "If this goes wrong, we're on our own." Mina closed her eyes for a moment, exhaustion threatening to overtake her. "We should have left the moment the disciple fell." "And what?" Lucas snapped, unable to hide the frustration in his voice. "Run? Hide in the mountains while the city burns? We had to stay." Mina opened her eyes, meeting his gaze with a tired but defiant look. "And now we're sitting ducks, Lucas. Shackled and waiting for a verdict we can't control." The tension between them lingered, the weight of their choices pressing heavily on all three. Hours passed, though it felt like days. The faint murmur of voices echoed beyond the chamber walls, but the trio remained alone. Their thoughts were interrupted by the sharp sound of the door creaking open. A dwarf in simple robes stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "You're to be separated," he announced flatly. "What?" Lucas rose to his feet, his chains clanking. "Why?" The dwarf didn't answer, gesturing to the guards behind him. "Orders from the council. Each of you will have time to speak in your defense during the hearing. Until then, you'll remain in separate quarters." Mina started to protest, but Thomas raised a hand to stop her. "They're trying to divide us," he said quietly, "to test our stories." Lucas hesitated, his frustration simmering beneath the surface. "Fine," he said finally, his voice tight. "But we're not guilty of anything." The guards didn't respond, instead pulling them apart with firm hands. Mina shot Lucas and Thomas a worried glance as she was led away, but neither had the chance to speak before the door slammed shut behind her. Lucas's cell was a stark contrast to the grand chambers of the Justice Hall. The stone walls were cold and bare, and the only furniture was a narrow cot and a small wooden table. A single torch burned in the corridor outside, casting flickering shadows on the walls. He paced the small space, his thoughts churning. The disciples' destruction had left the city in ruins, but they had done everything they could to save it. And yet, here they were, treated as criminals, their actions under scrutiny. A faint knock on the iron door caught his attention. One of the guards slid a tray of food through a small opening at the bottom. "Eat," the guard said gruffly. "You'll need your strength." Lucas ignored the tray, his appetite gone. "What's happening out there?" he asked, his voice sharp. "What about the others?" The guard didn't answer, retreating into the shadows. Lucas sighed, leaning back against the wall. His thoughts drifted to Mina and Thomas. Were they being interrogated? Were they okay? The uncertainty gnawed at him, and he clenched his fists, wishing there was something, anything, he could do. In another part of the justice hall, Mina sat on the edge of her cot, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to bandage a gash on her arm. The makeshift bindings she'd fashioned earlier were loose, and her fingers fumbled with the knot. A soft knock at the door startled her. Before she could respond, the hatch slid open, and a voice spoke from the other side. "You've got allies, you know." Mina frowned, her heart racing. "Who's there?" The voice chuckled softly. "A friend. Let's just say not everyone in this city thinks you should be locked away." Mina leaned closer to the door, her suspicion warring with a flicker of hope. "What do you want?" "To warn you," the voice said. "There are those who would see you scapegoated for what happened here. The council's divided, and your trial won't be as simple as you think." Mina's jaw tightened. "Who are you?" The voice didn't answer. Instead, the hatch slid shut, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Thomas, meanwhile, sat in silence, his broad shoulders hunched over as he stared at the floor of his cell. His mind was focused, calculating. He knew they would be tested, interrogated, perhaps even manipulated. He needed to keep a clear head, not just for himself, but for Lucas and Mina. The sound of approaching footsteps broke his concentration. The door creaked open, and a pair of robed dwarves entered, their expressions solemn. "Thomas," one of them began, "the council has questions for you." Thomas nodded, rising to his feet. "Then let's get this over with." As he followed them out of the cell, he couldn't shake the feeling that their ordeal was only just beginning. The council chamber of Korath was a marvel of dwarven engineering and artistry. Its walls were carved with intricate depictions of legendary judgments, dwarven lawgivers, and monumental battles. The dome above glimmered with faintly luminescent veins of gold and silver, and a vast circular table dominated the center of the room. Around it sat the Council of Elders, their faces lined with the weight of centuries and the burdens of governance. Lucas stood at the far end of the chamber, flanked by guards. His wrists ached from the iron shackles, but his attention was fixed on the figures seated before him. Mina and Thomas stood on either side, their expressions as tense as his own. At the head of the table sat Elder Arya, her piercing gaze sharp enough to cut stone. Beside her was Gorla, the dwarf council member with ties to the cult of the Sent Ones. Though her face remained impassive, Lucas caught the faintest flicker of concern in her eyes as she glanced at him. The chamber was filled with murmurs, the council members speaking in hushed tones before Elder Arya raised her hand. Silence fell instantly. "Lucas, Mina, Thomas," she began, her voice calm but commanding. "You stand here accused of instigating chaos within our city, aiding and abetting a rogue faction, and engaging in the destruction that claimed many lives. Yet you are also credited with the defeat of the Disciple, a feat that none among us can ignore." Lucas's heart pounded. The tension in the room was palpable, every word hanging heavy in the air. "You will each speak in your defense," Arya continued. "But know this, the truth will determine your fate. Our justice is swift and our patience is thin." Lucas was the first to step forward, his chains clinking with every movement. He took a deep breath, his mind racing for the right words. "We didn't come here to cause harm," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "We came to stop it. The Disciple of Earth wasn't just a threat to Korath, it was a threat to all of Hybris. We fought to protect this city, and we did everything in our power to save as many lives as we could." A council member to Arya's left, a stout dwarf with a braided beard, narrowed his eyes. "And yet you aligned yourselves with the cult of the Sent Ones, a group that has long been at odds with our people." Lucas hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "The cult has its flaws, but they're not our enemy. They were fighting the Disciple just as we were. Whatever disagreements exist between them and this city, they don't change what happened. We all stood together against a common foe." The council murmured again, their whispers carrying a mixture of doubt and curiosity. Mina was next. She stepped forward slowly, her injuries visible in the faint limp of her stride. She winced as she adjusted her stance, but her voice was resolute. "I've seen the devastation the Disciple left behind," she began. "I've seen people lose everything, homes, families, their sense of safety. We couldn't turn our backs on that. no matter the cost. Her gaze swept across the council, lingering on Elder Gorla. The cult of the Sent Ones isn't innocent. They've made mistakes, but so have we all. What matters is that we stop the disciple before it could do more damage. Elder Arya's expression didn't change, but her silence carried a weight that made Mina's next words falter. "And if you want to judge us for that," Mina added, her voice softer, "then judge us. But don't ignore what we've done for this city." Finally, Thomas stepped forward, his broad shoulders squared. He spoke with the calm confidence of someone used to command, though his eyes betrayed the strain of the past days. "We fought a war within your walls," he said bluntly. "A war none of you could have fought alone. The disciple wasn't just some beast. It was part of something bigger." His words drew immediate attention, the council members leaning forward slightly. Arya's eyes narrowed, and Gorla shifted in her seat. "What are you suggesting?" Arya asked, her tone sharp. Thomas hesitated for the briefest moment. "The disciple wasn't acting on its own. It was sent." "By whom?" another council member demanded. Thomas's gaze didn't waver. "The Empire." The chamber erupted in murmurs, voices overlapping as council members exchanged alarmed glances. Lucas felt his stomach drop. The Empire, an ancient, long-forgotten entity, was something few on Hybris dared to speak of, let alone claim involvement with. Arya raised her hand, silencing the room once more. Her voice was colder now, tinged with suspicion. "The Empire hasn't been mentioned in Hybris for over a millennium. You expect us to believe it's suddenly involved in our affairs?" Thomas nodded slowly. "Believe what you want, but the disciple wasn't a random event. It was part of a plan that's far from over." The council fell silent, their expressions a mixture of doubt, fear, and intrigue. Gorla leaned forward, her voice softer but no less firm. "If what you say is true, then why would the Empire care about Brumkorath? About the Sent Ones?" Thomas hesitated, glancing at Lucas and Mina. "We don't have all the answers yet, but the Sent Ones' prophecy might." Elder Arya leaned back in her chair, her gaze shifting between the three of them. "Your claims are bold, and your actions, while commendable in some respects, have left this city in turmoil. The council will deliberate, but know this, if you speak falsehoods, it will not go unanswered." The guards stepped forward, motioning for them to return to their positions. As they were led out of the chamber, Lucas caught a final glance from Gorla. Her expression was unreadable, but something about the look in her eyes gave him pause. Outside the council chamber, the trio was marched back toward their holding cells. The weight of their words and the potential consequences hung heavy in the air. "They don't believe us," Mina murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "They will," Thomas replied, his jaw set. "They have to." Lucas remained silent, his thoughts tangled in the implications of what Thomas had revealed. The Empire's shadow loomed larger now than it ever had before, and the path ahead felt more uncertain than ever.